Hi there, and welcome to Unknit If I Want To. I'm Andrea Maury of Andrea Renee Knits, and this is a weekly little Q&A where I do my best to answer some of your questions. They are most generally focused on knitting, but sometimes we dabble into some other crafts, and sometimes even into some health and life and personal stuff. And today I am wearing my golden hour shawl. This shawl is knit up with mosaic knitting along with some bubbles and some lace, picot edge, all the fun things. It's actually a worsted weight shawl, and it is knit out of Brooklyn tweed. It was done in their a single batch yarn. It's called Rancho One. So this specific yarn isn't available anymore, but a worsted weight would work great. Anyways, let's go on. Question number one. You just see me hesitate there. I was just remembering that I had not actually linked the pattern in the show notes, but I will before you watch this, so it's okay. I'll just write myself a note. All right, question number one. Hi Andrea, I love your videos and look forward to watching them every Friday while my toddler naps and I can knit. I've been knitting for years, but there is one thing I've always wondered about. When you're knitting and the pattern says to measure your work from the cast on edge, should you measure to below the needle, only including the stitches that are worked, or include the needle since the stitches on it will be worked as the pattern progresses? I assume it's not a big deal as long as you stick to one method and use it consistently, but it plagues me nonetheless. I kind of surprised myself by picking this question because I don't know. I think I kind of do a little in between. Like, I'm gonna be real honest here. I'm trying to think of exactly how I hold my tape measure. You know what I think I probably do is like I fudge it a little bit depending on if it is to the length I need it or not, you know, and I'll be like, good enough. Because I think at the end of the day, a lot of times it's really, whenever I can in my patterns, unless it's really stitch pattern dependent, I am generally going to tell you to knit to a certain length because I think that's a lot easier for people to hit that target than telling them the specific row they need to knit to, because a lot of times if you get stitch gauge, sometimes you don't get row gauge, and so it's just an easier way to do things. And so by being able to say like, okay, now knit this for 10 inches, I mean, sometimes that means you might be like right in between, like almost like half a row, you know? And so you can kind of give or take like that might be when I measure right to like below the needle. So I think generally speaking, the way I do it is, let me see if I can grab some knitting here. Okay. All right, things like this I could learn my lesson and actually prepare for before I start recording, but what would the fun in that be? So basically, if I was holding up my needle and I'm measuring, I think generally speaking, I tend to hold my measuring tape right there. Is it focused on it? I never know. Yeah, so like right there. So it's basically, I hold it exactly below my cord, right at the top of, like right there. So not, I guess I don't hold it up on top of the stitches on the needle. I tend to hold it right beneath the cord where there's that kind of solid base. So that's what I do. I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong there because unless you're really getting into some like very bulky knitting, and then, you know, that could be the difference of half an inch or more. But for most knitting that's within that like fingering to worsted weight range, having one or less row is not going to make or break whatever you're knitting. But I would be very curious as to what some other people do. So I would love to hear what other people think. Where do you like to measure to? Do you include the needle, the stitches on the needle, or do you go to that row just below? Let us know. All right. Gauge. After knitting a gauge to help with deciding on which size garment to knit, which size needle to use, etc., Do you usually check your gauge again once you have begun a sweater? What is the best way to do this? So I don't, unless I'm concerned, unless I'm like, ooh, this does not, it feels like my gauge has changed and like my swatch lied to me. And then I might kind of do a little checky check, which actually I just did that recently. Because I was just like, ooh, is this gonna be too small? I was just a little worried that my gauge wasn't translating, even though I knit a whole bunch of gauge swatches. So it's like, I don't know why I wasn't trusting it, but sometimes it feels like they can lie. Where I would recommend doing that is actually more between if you're doing different stitch motifs, or stitch patterns, i.e., for example, if you're doing like a colorwork sweater, I would definitely see, okay, did I tighten up my gauge for that colorwork or did it stay even with my stockinette? And the other, or my non-colorwork section, and the other place I would do that is my sleeves. So that's usually the only two times I would generally check gauge as I'm working. And then I'm not necessarily comparing it to my gauge swatch, because as we know, swatches can change a lot after we've washed and dried them. They may have grown or whatever. So what I really would be comparing it to if I'm checking gauge as I'm working on something is that my personal gauge is staying consistent throughout my project. And there's certain things that can really affect that consistency, namely being things like stranded color work that you might really tighten up, or small circumference versus large circumference knitting. For example, the body of your sweater compared to the sleeves of your sweater. Most knitters tighten up when they are doing small circumference knitting compared to when they are doing large circumference knitting. That's why a lot of times I recommend going up a needle size for sleeves, because across the board, I notice people really tightening up their sleeve gauge. So that is when I would double check that. And they go on to say, what's the best way to do this? It can be tricky if knitting in the round since the stitches get bunched up. Do you use barber cords to take your work off the needle to check gauge? I think that's a great idea. And you don't necessarily have to take your whole project off, depending on, you just want to get a big enough area to have it lay flat. So, you don't have to necessarily get all the stitches off your needle. I have heard you talk about the great idea of comparing a favorite already knit or bought sweater. Tell me more so I can more confidently knit more garments in the right size. So I have mentioned this quite a few times before, but basically, just to sum it up quickly, all it is grabbing a sweater you already love that's in your closet and taking its measurements. So that way when you are looking at knitting patterns to knit yourself a new sweater, you can kind of compare to find your right size by comparing the schematic or the listed measurements of that pattern with the sweater you measured from your closet. So it's just comparing the two to help you determine which size is best for you. I do also like to pay attention to details like the sweater construction, mostly paying attention to the yoke of the sweater. So is it a drop shoulder where the seams kind of like this t-shirt? So this would be like a drop shoulder sweater where the shoulder drops off. It's not meant to kind of like shape around the shoulder. It lands here and the body of the sweater actually becomes part of the sleeve. Or is it a round yoke sweater, which is how we usually see colorwork sweaters that have like a colorwork yoke? Or is it a raglan where we see diagonal seams coming from the underarm up to the neck? And paying attention to which style of sweater the one is that you're measuring, because that might be the measurements you like for that style of sweater, and they might be different for a different style of sweater. For instance, I really love 10 inches of positive ease on a drop shoulder sweater, but for a round yoke sweater, a lot of times I like 0. I don't like any ease, depending on the style. So just something to consider as well. All right, I have been wanting to knit the throwback cardigan, but I have not done very much color work at all. And when I have done it, I was knitting in the round. On Ravelry, it sounds like the sweater is knitted flat. When you are on a purl set of rows, are you also doing color work? Yes, you are. So it's pretty minimal. There's not a ton of color work. It's a worsted weight sweater, so the color work goes by fairly quickly, but you are working color work on the wrong sides. And you're going to do it just like you do it when you knit. You just read the chart from the other direction. And I do the same trick that I have shared before where I kind of spread out my stitches on my right hand needle. So as I go to purl, it keeps a really nice even tension in my floats. But it is always the conundrum for us designers is people tend to be very wary of steeking. So if you're not familiar with steeking, that's when we cut open our knitting. And so a lot of cardigans are actually worked in the round, and then afterwards people reinforce the edges of where they want to cut it open, either through crochet or sewing them on a sewing machine, and then they snip, snip, snip all the way up, and then they fold that little edge back and pick up a button band. So the other option, if you don't do that, is to work your cardigan flat. And it's my conundrum, because a lot of people do not necessarily want to purl color work, but a lot of other people don't want to steek. So I would actually love to hear from all y'all about if you could choose, and I have a feeling this is going to be 50-50, but maybe not, maybe I'll be surprised. And would you choose steeking or purling when it comes to a color work cardigan? So let me know, because I have some new ones percolating up here that I would love to think about that feedback from everyone. Okay. Hi, Andrea. This seems so basic, but can you talk about why some yarn comes in twisted skeins? I sometimes see them called a hank, and some comes in a skein or ball ready to knit. I despise balling yarn, mostly because the ball winder I have is the literal worst knitting item I own. I used to have a really bad one too that drove me bonkers. Why can't yarn come pre-wound into a ball? Related, do you have a ball winder that you would recommend? Because clearly I need a new one. So this is actually a good question. I don't know that I know the full answer, but I'm going to give my assumption. So I think a lot of the yarn that you're seeing in skeins, it's because it comes from cones that then the yarn company winds off part of the cone into a skein, and that's what you're buying, because a whole bunch of yarn comes on a cone. The other reason for this is because dyers, and maybe actually I know some dyers actually get it already in skeins, so it depends where they're getting their yarn from. But it's also because they have to dye it, and they can't dye it when it's in a ball, or the middle of the ball would probably stay white. You know, they need to be able to open that up. So that's one of the main reasons that I could think of is hand dyers need to be able to dye it in a skein as opposed to in a ball. But I would be curious, maybe we'll have some industry people chime in here on if there's any other reasons why. So it's called the put up of the yarn, and yeah, why some companies, there's not very many that I know that still use the traditional ball. Well, actually that's not necessarily true, there's still quite a few. So yeah, I would be interested to know if there's other reasons. The first thing that popped in my head was like, well, for dyeing it, but I would be curious to hear what other reasons there may be for that. You know, I think sometimes it's visual, like a trend, you know, so the put up changes with the times. So people prefer being able to like open up that skein and feel the yarn, or, you know, to me, the balls that we used to see them in a lot more are probably a lot easier to stack in a yarn shop, but I don't know, I'd be curious too. And as far as a ball winder goes, I have linked one in the past. I'll see if I can find the link again. I don't know the name of it off the top of my head. And I lost my pen. This is not going well, you guys. I really don't trust that I won't forget this. Didn't I just have it? Oh, here we go. Let's just do the sorry turning. Oh no. Oh no. Okay. And don't forget, Andrea, what you were gonna write. Oh, ball winder. All right. Oh, I like this pen. These are good pens. Okay, so last question. Oh, I will also say though, there's lots of different ball winders out there. like some of the even smaller ones. Mine can hold a lot of yarn. That was important to me when I was first looking for one. But there are some of those like little ones. There's one that's like creamish colored and red. I think there's also like a blue and white or cream one. And those ones are little like workhorses. So just to throw that out there too. I'll kind of peek around and throw some links down below. Okay. Refocus. I will soon be casting on your weekender sweater pattern, but I'm nervous about the center seam. I just finished a pattern that had a side seam using a purl stitch, but the knit stitch that followed that purl was always loose which then created an entire loose row column going down the length of the purl seam. I think they called it laddering. I tried tightening it up that knit stitch every time I came around to it, but it didn't seem to help. Can I fix this? Signed, Nervous in New York. So yes, I have heard of that happening. One thing I would say is maybe when you do your gauge swatch for your weekender, put that little slip stitch seam in there and see how it looks for you. And maybe even snap a before and after. So see how it looks with just your swatch, and then see if blocking helps any of those discrepancies that might happen. Outside of that, what I would think about doing is, I think what happens is sometimes people get nervous about that and then they tug on the stitch just after, and it actually exacerbates that issue instead of helping it. It's kind of like the ladder when you're doing double pointeds or something like that. You actually, in that scenario, you want to tug on the second stitch in from the gap from DPNs. That will help reduce the ladder more than tugging on the very first stitch. So you could try that trick. The weekender is knit inside out, and so you could, after you go past your slip stitch for that seam, you could the second stitch in, kind of give that an extra tug, see if that helps. One of the other things I was thinking about was you could work that stitch through I was kind of forgetting that we work that sweater inside out, because otherwise it would just be a ton of purling, and people don't generally want to do that much purling. If it was purling, you can actually wrap your yarn around your purl stitch going in the opposite direction, and it uses a little bit less yarn, so that would tighten it up. With knitting, you wouldn't really want to knit it through the back loop, because that would just make it look more obvious. So yeah, I would play around and with your swatch, and I would block that. But try tugging on the second stitch after the slip seam, and take before and afters of your swatch and block it and see if it works out for you. I've had no problem. I've never noticed that in my own. But yeah, I think maybe sometimes it's made worse if you try and tug real hard on that first stitch right after the seam. So I hope that helps. All right, we've got some knit-alongs going on. The Rhinebeck knit-along, what is the actual start date on that one? It's this month, but you can already jump in and start preparing your yarn. Again, Sam and Kayla, the amazing hosts, they have been doing like a fun little Instagram live, so you can go to the Magpie feed to check out for any of that. And if you actually go to my Instagram, I also sent it out in the original newsletter for the Alp and Glow release. You can see I had little Sam and Kayla made these beautiful little tiles, and they're on my Instagram as well, to describe the knit along, the rules, the when, the where, the how, all that good stuff. And the DRK Spin It to Knit It knit along for the weekender is going strong. I am figuring my own out. I would love to hear how all y'all's is going. And also, this is the very last month for the Inclinations Cowl knit along. So have you finished yours? It's not too late. You can probably still start and finish before the end. It ends at the end of this month. So anyways, thank you so much for joining me again this lovely Friday, and I hope that I get to see you back here next week. Happy knitting.